This is Alexa Linton, and you're listening to the Whole Horse Podcast. We're now in season 6. Thanks to all of you tuning in and sharing the podcast with your friends to keep the momentum going. This podcast is dedicated to all things horse and all things that uplift equine well-being and welfare. And I'm having down-to-earth conversations with equine professionals about the little things that move the dial slowly but surely towards a better world for horses. You'll find all the episodes, 93 and counting now, on iTunes, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcast. Thanks for being here and enjoy the ride. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Whole Horse Podcast. You may or may not know that this is the 100th episode of the Whole Horse Podcast, which feels auspicious and important for whatever reason. Maybe it's just a number. But yeah, I'm excited to be here with you doing this thing still, and knowing that a bunch of you are still like tuning in and enjoying yourself and learning stuff. So that is amazing. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome back Felicity Davies to the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm super excited, and I feel very honored to be a part of your 100th episode because it's big, like committing to this and putting episodes out there. And yeah, it's really big. And just think about like how much value is in those 100 episodes. Like it's really incredible, isn't it?
It's pretty cool to have a little reflection back and just to have a think on, and you probably do this with your podcast too, is this sense of like the people that have reached out and said like, oh, this changed this, or this like shifted my path here, or I learned so much about this in this podcast. Like I have a friend who's like, yeah, I went back and like re-listened to this one podcast. It was super helpful. I'm like, oh yeah.
Totally. Yeah. And I don't know about you, but like I find podcasting really healing for me. Like it's just really interesting to have those different versions of you documented, and like even producing an episode, like we were just speaking about before we hit record. Sometimes you just don't know what's going to come out of your mouth or where the conversation goes. And then you're like, oh, I didn't even know I had that in me. But yeah, do you feel a similar way?
Oh my gosh, I totally feel a similar way. And every now and again, I'll like jot down notes and things, but sometimes it's just super stream of consciousness, which all of you out there probably realize. But yeah, it's just like, okay, what wants to occur today? What wants to come forward? What, it was like, so Felicity and I did a podcast for her podcast, The Equestrian Perspective. I think it came out this last week, which if you guys are listening would be a couple of weeks ago. But it was really interesting because we didn't quite know where it was going to go. It took these turns that we both did not expect, and where a lot of people went, whoa, I didn't know that, or oh, that was like really helpful information for me. And we're just kind of having a convo. So yeah, it's pretty cool that way.
It's really, really cool. And I think it's interesting as well because I think when you're producing something, you have an idea of like what people want to listen to and the direction that they want to head in. And sometimes, I don't know about you, but for me, sometimes those things can feel a little surface level. And then when I'm behind the scenes with people, I'm like, I'm talking way deeper. I'm exploring all these other things. And it's interesting to just allow the part of you that just wants to go deep to just go deep and go wherever it needs to go. And it's so interesting as well, seeing how people are really craving that depth, and they want to have places where they can listen to those things. And yeah, it's cool to give yourself that permission slip to just go wherever you need to go and trust that people will receive it however they're meant to. And it is what it is.
Yeah. Amen to that. It's super fun. And as you can imagine here, like we have a lot of fun just like hanging out and chatting with cool peeps and
totally
learning new stuff, right? So yeah, I think I get just as much value out of doing this work as everybody else, and I get an excuse to chat with people, which is awesome. So that's great. And I feel like, looking back over my podcast, this sense of the ways that it's connected. Like even this week, I had one of my apprenticeship students who has connected with another one of my apprenticeship students who is now hosting Lockie Phillips in Ottawa. And just this sense, I asked the one student, I was like, how did this happen? I feel like I was a matchmaker, but I'm not sure. She's like, oh yeah, I was listening to your podcast and then I joined apprenticeship and like then I was like, oh yeah, okay. Like these ways that like things connect us, right, in this particular world. Like you just kind of never know how it's going to happen. So
no.
yeah.
And you were mentioning before about the messages that you've received when people like do share with you about how it has really impacted them. And they're only the messages that you have received.
Yeah.
Like just, you just think of the ripple effect of the things that you're not even aware of. And it's like, wow, this is big. This is really big.
Totally. And I do say this to you guys all the time, but like, reach out if you feel like it. I even have like if you haven't been on Instagram or on my account on Instagram, I know Felicity, you have an Instagram account for your podcast, and I did the same thing. So I did like at Whole Horse Podcast as my tag, and I think you're at Equestrian Perspective.
Yeah, it's just new, just starting, because I had a client reach out to me and she was like, Felicity, there's so many like golden nuggets on your podcast. You need to put this out there more. And I was like, I don't want to spam. It's interesting having a personal like page as well that is your brand at the same, like, I don't want to spam that with just podcast stuff, but I'm like, I want that stuff to go. So it's a separate page now.
Totally.
Did you feel a similar way with yours?
I did. Yeah. Cause I was constantly putting up, it's a new episode, and mine is more my other Instagram, which you can follow as well, is more of a personal page. Like it's me putting up cute photos of my animals and me wearing, you know, some other random pair of overalls and things like that, you know? And the occasional poignant post. So yeah, that is an opportunity for anyone who wants to like follow along on the journey to check it out and keep like up to date with episodes and things like that. But you know, I think what people often assume is like that there's like the production team maybe, or like stuff going on behind the scenes. I don't know if it's the same for you, Felicity, but like it's all me. Like I'm on Audacity doing my little thing, publishing everything myself. And which has been really quite a learning curve. But I think, you know, lots of times when people are listening to podcasts, it's like, oh yeah, there's like this whole thing happening behind the scenes. And no, there's not. But sometimes. Yeah.
Like I was the same, doing it all myself for a long period of time, and I feel very grateful, but I've got an amazing assistant. Her name's Amy, and she's a past client of mine, super aligned. And she's just editing the podcast. But I find it really interesting because recently I was listening to another podcast, not horse related, and it's a really big podcast. It's on Spotify. And it was the Call Her Daddy podcast, but this woman was interviewing Christina Aguilera, and I'm like, she's really cool. I wanted to listen to it. But I found it so interesting that she has this huge production team, but the like audio of the host was like really loud and the audio of Christina was so quiet. And I was like, how do they do this without a team when like you and I are sitting here being like, let's make sure the audio's it's really interesting. I don't know if this is just a Virgo in me, like
Oh man. Well, let's get into like horses, because that's why we're all here, I suppose.
Yeah.
You know, and just because I wanted to dive in a little bit, you know, I'm sure some of you have listened to Felicity's podcast, The Equestrian Perspective, and some of you have maybe listened to my other episode with her. But I would love to know, because I think that your, should we call it training styles, your way of being with horses has really changed over, you know, even the last few years, from what I've been seeing. I would love to know a little bit more about that, because I know I'm sort of in a similar-ish boat, but not being a trainer as such. Like I hang out and work with my girls, but what's kind of, what's really grabbing you at the moment? What are you finding super valuable?
Yeah. So I guess when I think about this, like I started my quote unquote horse training business in the middle of 2019. So I haven't been doing this that long. But I like to kind of share that from the point of view of like things can change really quickly. And so I started in 2019, and this was just me diving into horsemanship and really finding new ways of doing things with my horses who had previously competed. And it was just very illuminating seeing the changes in them just from me being more mindful and aware of what I was doing. And then from there, I've gone down many different rabbit holes. And early 2020, I started supporting people online predominantly. And it's been really, really interesting watching that journey kind of unravel. And it's also interesting as I'm helping people in real time, I'm learning at the same time. And I don't know about you, but as you might find this in your other areas of work, but it's interesting because as I'm learning, it's almost like I feel like I need to assimilate that into something that I can teach right away. Because I'm like, this is so valuable. I need to kind of funnel that into you or direct you somewhere. And it's just so many rabbit holes to go down. But at the moment with my clients, I'm really just working on the importance of understanding the principles behind how horses learn. I think this is something that a lot of people assume that they know or assume others know, and most people don't. And I'm not saying that from a point of view of being like, oh, people are stupid or anything like that. It's just like people just aren't taught this stuff, or they don't understand the real principles underlying how their horse learns and how to connect with their horse. And it's so empowering once you understand those pieces. So I'm working with people predominantly around that through an online course that I have mainly. And also I'm weaving in a lot more sort of like spiritual connection-based stuff as well. So last year I did a 3-month program to develop my intuitive gifts. And then I've woven in sort of energy readings and healings and things like that as well in my group sessions and also in one-on-one sessions. And it's just been really cool to see the parallels between the real like compassionate, mindful horsemanship and also really looking at your horse as a guide on your journey, because as we all know, they're such a mirror for us, and just allowing them to support us and illuminate things for us and teach us. And just as much as we're supporting them, they're supporting us, probably even more. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question fully, but there's many different rabbit holes we can take this down.
Well, I have some questions that twigged in me, this remembering about some posts you did on sort of like the difference between desensitization and acclimatization with horses, because here in North America, let's say, and I think Australia is similar-ish, is there was this huge movement around natural horsemanship and like desensitizing and the phases and throwing so much stuff at our horses as this sort of training methodology, which essentially is like this, you know, in my mind, looking back and going and cringing a little bit, just this sense of flooding a horse's nervous system with various things. And I know that this is now something that we're getting more nuanced about, thank goodness.
Yeah,
and I would love to hear, because I know this is an area you work in a lot, you know, kind of how you're viewing that and what steps you're taking to support horses to feel more confident in their environments.
Yeah, totally. And I'm really glad that you brought this up, because this is, I think, something that people can get really like, they go too far in or they get really scared of because they think it's bad. And then you're kind of left going, well, what am I meant to do? So the way that I like to look at, firstly, when we think about desensitizing, when you look at the definition of it, it is to, what is the definition now? I'm going to think of it off the top of my head. It's like systematically exposing a horse to low levels of its fears. And you do it in a way where you're honoring the horse's emotions, you're exposing them to low levels of its fears, you're helping them through that. And then as they grow in confidence, you can increase the levels of the environmental pressure that you're using, right? So that's what that is. Whereas flooding is essentially like exposing a horse to something that they're not in control of at all. You're not really looking at how comfortable the horse is or isn't, and you're just waiting until the horse seems fine. right? So this is commonly like a lot of people will do this where they're like, oh, I'm going to spray my horse with fly spray, and until you stand still, I'm going to like keep spraying you, and then might retreat away. Or like the horse just doesn't have an option to say like, yes, keep going, or no, stop. Same with saddling like young horses. Put the saddle on, let them buck it out, then they'll seem fine. And it's like, that's flooding the horse. The horse doesn't have an option. And then they just learn to, a lot of the time, shut down because their fight or flight option's been denied, right? So with desensitizing, I think it's really, really important. And this is where I love people to have full context of the process, because often sometimes people will think, oh yeah, my groundwork's pretty good. My relationship with my horse is pretty good. This is what we need to work on. They're scared of this thing. And it's like, when you go back through the other pieces in terms of addressing the environment, both on an internal and an external level for both horse and human, get that comfortable, get that addressed. Then you address your relationship in terms of how, like, is your horse happy to see you, right? Like, how comfortable are they with you? Do you spend time with them doing things that your horse likes, right? Really solidifying that foundation, because if both their and your basic needs aren't met, then of course there's going to be things that pop up in your training, or your horse just might be spookier than they would normally be if their basic needs are met and things like that. Then I like to go, okay, well, how's your groundwork? Like, can your horse even just stand still comfortably with you doing nothing? A lot of horses just can't do that. So it's really just working on that emotional regulation piece. And that really ties in nicely with what like Celeste is bringing into the horse world as well. So like, really like foundational groundwork pieces, like, do you understand how to clearly communicate with your horse? Are you comfortable just standing with your horse? Can you clearly apply your cues so that your horse actually understands you, right? And then from there, I find a lot of the times, most horses that people think are really spooky and unpredictable, they're not spooky and unpredictable anymore because they've got that foundation set. Then what I like to use the desensitizing for, or the exposure training, and I like to say both because I think some horses aren't really scared of these things. So I do think it is an exposure training process. And for me, I find it more often than not, it's more beneficial for the human than the horse. Okay. So for some people, they have a lot of what ifs coming into their minds. Like maybe they want to trail ride and they're like, oh my goodness, I'm worried. Like what if an animal jumps out in the distance? Or what if there's some noise behind them from a car driving down the road or whatever? And it's about going, okay, well, let's see how your horse copes with the different elements that make up these different environmental pressures. So I break them down into approach, movement, noise, and touch. And you work on them all independently first at a really low level. And you see how your horse is in different areas, with them standing still, with them moving. And also, how do you feel through the process, right?
Yeah.
And you're doing it on the ground first, really making sure that your horse understands how to manage themselves and how to regulate, right? And come back into that parasympathetic state, and also making sure that you can. So doing that on the ground and then under saddle. And you can see how this is a really seamless way for people to either see, my horse is fine, I've gone through all the prep work, I can put that what if aside because we're good. Or they can see, oh, my horse is really worried about movement in the distance. Okay, we need to do a bit more work on that. And now I understand how. And like, it's just a really empowering process to just be able to kind of check those boxes off. Or if you've had a horse that has maybe freaked out by something in the past, like a client of mine, she had a horse that was really quiet. But one day there was this big sort of like parade of people that came down her road, like loud music, making a lot of noise, and her thoroughbred went nuts and just was running around super stressed. And then whenever he heard loud music, he would freak out. And she was like, I'm worried I'm going to be riding, and then maybe a car comes down the road with loud music, and what if he freaks out? I'm like, you should be worried. You need to do some work on getting him feeling comfortable with that, or like counter conditioning him to that, because he's scared. It's a trigger for him. So yeah, there's lots of really cool ways that you can use it, but like you're noticing, it's a process. It's not necessarily like, oh, your horse is worried about fly spray, go straight to that. It's like, no, how good is everything else first? Yeah.
I love that. I wrote a post, I don't know if you read it, but it was a while back, on capacity. And it had like tons of shares and tons of comments. Like people really seem to resonate with this idea, because I was talking about how I had taken Diva out for a ride with my barn mate, and we had gone a different route, and it was full of triggers, like just action packed. So there was ambulances going by with their sirens on, dogs barking, like 2 dogs at once, like on their leash, straining, barking, construction site, on and on and on and on. Like just new things. We had to go down kind of like an area where the hills were up the sides, and, the cougar territory, so to speak. And there was all these pieces to it. By the time we got back to the barn, we were both kind of in shambles. And it was just really, really hard. And in the past, I think I would have been in this place of like, okay, we got to keep going out on that ride, and then it'll get better, and it'll right. And I realized at that time, and this is what I talked about in the post, this capacity piece of like, number one, like, why do I need to like conquer this thing? I don't need to go on this ride. It's not necessary. There's other ways to go. And there's so many variables, right? It's close to the road. It's close to town. It's very heavily trafficked. You can't really predict all the things that are going to occur on like a ride like that, right? Yeah. And so to try to actually work all those pieces is almost like, for me, with a horse like Diva, who tends to be less confident, especially around like what I call man-made things, just seemed like so stressful on both of us. And it was this real relief to go, okay, like we don't have to do that again. We don't have to put ourselves in that situation. It's like over top of the capacity that either of us have to work with all of this stimulus and all the trigger stacking that could possibly occur on this ride, right?
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting that you bring that up, because I had a client who booked a session with me, and she's just like, oh, I really want to help my horse feel more comfortable being in the forest. Like, we've gone there, but he just seems really worried by the time we get out there. Like, he's fine riding in this paddock, but going out there. And she's like, I feel really guilty because all we do is ride in the arena otherwise. I'm like, but is he happy with that? Like, it's clear that he's finding going to the forest, particularly on his own, like uncomfortable. But I think a lot of riders have this thing in their mind, like, I need to make sure what I'm doing with my horse is super varied, and I need to take them out there, and because it's fun for them. And sure, it can be fun for us and fun for them sometimes. But sometimes taking them out, like you said, there can be a lot of variables. Yeah.
And it can be super overwhelming.
Totally.
And I found for myself, I wasn't able to stay regulated. That really felt like the moment of like, okay, so I'm over my capacity now. We're both totally over. And that, like, that's felt like a bit of a recipe for me for not necessarily disaster, but like definitely not fun at that point, right?
Yeah. And I think as well, if there are people listening thinking like, oh, but I do want to event something like that, there are ways that you can do that too. So what I would have done is gone, okay, well, and this is for anyone listening, like, you can think about what has triggered me and my horse in the past, and just write it down. And then you can go, okay, well, with that trigger, break it down into the elements. Was it movement? Was it noise? Was it something approaching them? Was it something touching them? And in what location? And then when you've got that information, you can start to tease it apart. So it's not just one big thing. And sure, like, if you're like, oh, you wouldn't necessarily desensitize or exposure train your horse to an ambulance, because who has an ambulance handy, right? But you could go, okay, well, I'm going to YouTube ambulance noises, and I'm going to get them comfortable with the ambulance noises. And I'm going to maybe get a friend who drives a car I'm going to ride, and then they can drive the car past me. And if my horse is worried, I can turn and follow the car and build up their confidence. Like, there's lots of different pieces that you can do. And this is where, especially for people that compete or do want to put their horses in more busy environments, there's so much power in understanding how to break all of these pieces down and how to shape them out. But you have to make sure, are their basic needs met? How's your relationship? Is your groundwork good before you dive into that? Otherwise, you're just band-aiding what isn't already good. You need to have the emotional regulation piece for both of you at least established first before you dive into this, because that will make the whole process so much smoother and so much easier. But it's really empowering if you wanted to kind of conquer something that perhaps is a little bit bigger, to know that you don't have to just ride them through that route and give them more miles. You can break it apart into all the different pieces.
I love that. That sense of breaking it down, because I think that was a part that has been missed in horsemanship a lot, is
totally
like this sense that we can do way, way less and build on a skill set, right? Whereas I think for so long, it was like, okay, we just throw them into the situation, throw them into the deep end, and then like hope for the best. And has that ever worked for any of us? I do not think so. It's that sense of, okay, let's start in the shallow end. Let's put the water wings on. Let's like work on putting our face in the water and coming out. Let's build the skill set over time so the confidence levels come up. And I just I really love that. So thank you. Now I'm curious as well, and I'm sure some of the listeners are like, so with your training, I know you've been doing some clicker training. I know you've been doing some other things. What is your kind of favorite way to work with exposure training or desensitization with horses?
Yeah. So I think, it comes back to the horse, because I find obviously you want to have all the other pieces that I mentioned in terms of environment, relationship, groundwork established with whatever type of reinforcement that you like to use. With the desensitizing or exposure training, like I mentioned, it depends on the horse. And I think it depends on if the horse has had a previously bad experience with something. Because sometimes I find, and this is my personal experience, other people that use food rewards may be able to approach it differently. But sometimes I find if the horse is food motivated and they understand the clicker training and all of that, and you're introducing something that the horse is worried about, sometimes that can either mask their true feelings underneath it, because they're doing something for the food. They're more focused on the food than actually coming back into their body if something worries them. So in those cases, if I'm working with a horse that I think is either shutting down or focusing on the food, or maybe getting a little bit frustrated because they're trying to earn the food, but they're actually really worried, for me, I prefer to take the food away in that instance and just work on, okay, well, can they stand still in my presence first and feel comfortable and process and all of that, and then add in the different environmental stimulus. If you have a horse that's really, really worried about something, absolutely, it works to kind of get them to target the object or do some counter conditioning first, because then you're kind of going, hey, this isn't bad. And then you can next get to the process of being like, hey, when I move this means nothing. You're really responding to my energy, not necessarily the object or the thing itself. And I think this is where a lot of people can get a little bit desensitizing, it just makes your horse dull. And I get it from the word, because it's desensitize, reduce sensitivity. You're yeah, I get that. But really what you're trying to show your horse is when I'm relaxed, it doesn't matter what's going on around us. Of course, you can still look at things and you can still be oh, what's that? But when I'm relaxed, we're good. And I can be waving an object, right? But if I pick my energy up and ask you to move, like I've taught you in our groundwork, and I'm still waving a thing, I'd like you to move, please. Right? So it's more of a energetic exchange rather than it's all intention based. So it's if you are waving a flag and you're relaxed, you're oh yeah, I'm just waving the flag. But then if I'm I'd like you to go out in a circle, please, and I use the flag to kind of call up a bit of energy if they're unsure, I want them to move forward with that intention and that energetic cue and that physical cue. So I think that's another thing. And for anyone that's worried about their horse getting dull through that kind of process, that's where it's important to establish good groundwork and response to pressure or whatever types of cues that you're using first, because there's some people that have really quiet young horses, for example, just quiet horses. And if you don't have the ability to ask them to move already, then it's a lot harder to get them to move, especially if they're I'm fine with all of this other stuff. You don't have that innate sensitivity to work with. So that's where doing it in the order is important. Yeah, I covered a lot of bits there, but
yeah, no, helpful. I know one of the things And it is interesting. I do relate to the food rewards piece because I've taken to bringing food rewards, not high value, just hay cubes and things out with us. And one of the things that Diva and I encounter is we live on a road, and that road has like semi trucks, like big trucks, sometimes logging trucks, sometimes like big stuff. And trucks have never been her favorite thing. And they come not often, but they do come.
Yeah.
So she can handle cars and trucks of like normal size, and all of those sorts of things. But then when we get into like the bigger trucks, I do find that food rewards, it is kind of a distraction because it tends to be a bit of a tricky thing to train in some ways. Now, I'm sure that that's not, that there are, now that I'm even asking the question, more baby steps that we can work with. But, you know, I think it's like for all of us, this sense of, can I just take more time?
Yeah.
I think that's really like a big piece that it comes down to, because we want to, like, I want to go out and go on a ride rather than like just taking my horse out to graze on the side of the road and just chilling while trucks go by, and right, like having that moment, right?
Yeah. And I understand like everyone's going to have their process. So for some people, they're going to be in the position where like, no, I still want to do this thing, or I still want to ride, or maybe I want to use the food rewards. And you can absolutely do that. When the truck comes past, like counter condition her to that experience. You can still feel that they're not 100%, but it's going to probably be better than you doing nothing. And then like, I'm assuming that's going to be better for them. And like I said, depends on the horse, but yeah, it just comes back to everyone's on their own journey, and often people will wait until they either have a horse that like absolutely requires them to go this slow, or your intuition gets so loud that it's forcing you to try like take a different approach, right? So I'll often have clients who are like, they're going through things and it might not necessarily be desensitizing, could just be groundwork. And you can see like from my end, I'm like, oh yeah, there's some definite holes in their training, and they're like, oh yeah, I've booked this lesson on the weekends, like I'm gonna go. I'm like, okay, cool, like how's that feel to you, like what's your approach, like if you get there, like are you comfortable? If your horse is not comfortable, like foregoing the lesson or just doing it on the ground or just treating that as a training experience and then coming home, like what's your approach? And I remember I had one particular client who took her horse out and she was working on trailer loading at home, and he was getting better, got him there, and then she was like, oh yeah, like I think he had a really good time. He was like jig jogging at the front of the at the front of the group on the trail ride, and then he didn't want to get back on the trailer. Like it took us ages. I had to get someone to help us, and then I like had to kind of politely say, do you think he actually had a good time? Do you know what I mean? Like he was jig jogging, he didn't want to get on the trailer. Like let's just actually look at how our horse is, rather than like, sure, you might have had an all right time, but how is your horse feeling? And I think as well for the people that are like, no, I just want to ride through this thing, or I just want to do this, like, and this is where the intuition piece will get louder. Like, how is your horse actually feeling? And are you okay with that?
Yeah, because oftentimes in those sorts of scenarios, I know from personal experience, that's the point where we tend to start maybe having a little fight with our horse, maybe having a little brace with our horse, maybe, you know, losing our temper a little bit, or, like starting to feel frustration. We start to dysregulate essentially in those moments, potentially, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it comes back to like that disconnect of like your mind being like, no, I must do this, and your body being like, no.
No, that's been huge for me. I mean, I think after this past year, but also like as you get older, you know, I turned 43, which is not super old. I know that. But you know, I have a body that's been through a lot, and so falling off and stuff is like hard. You know, we talked about that on your podcast, and this sense of how, you know, when I was younger, I might have been more game to push through, make something happen. force an issue. I mean, I remember experiences that make me so cringy with Diva where I was like, yeah, we got this. And now I look back and go, yeah, she was super flooded, super dysregulated, major trigger stacking happened. She was feeling super unsafe. And it's become more and more of a priority for me. And it sounds like for you, it's like, how can my horse feel safe in all of these scenarios? And what would that look like to build a sense of that safety for us so that it is enjoyable and not just sort of a wild ride and just praying that you're in one piece by the end, right?
Absolutely. And I think just going on that journey itself can feel really hard because we're so conditioned to, we have horses in our lives a lot of the time to go out on these trail rides and go and do these things and spend all this time with them. And then going down this path of actually acknowledging how your horse is feeling and how you're feeling, it brings a lot of stuff up to the surface that you have to move through. Like even a client recently said, I'm working on just like standing with my horse and letting him process. And she was like, I could feel myself getting really frustrated at how long it was taking. And it was like interesting to have a discussion about that. And then she also had an experience where she was like, my horse was really grumpy today. He was just in off mood. And one of my other clients, and this is such a good like power of having community, she was like, gave us some really great questions to reflect on of like, how are you that day? How was your horse that day? What changed? Did the weather change? You're allowed to have a bad day. Is he allowed to have a bad day? And I think sometimes, especially like we're saying with the conditioning, you're so like, I have horses in my life to do this thing. And it's illuminating, recognizing where we objectify them. And it's a lot to move through. And that's where I really want to make clear to anyone who's listening, regardless of your journey, whether you are taking as much time as you need and you're taking these baby steps, or whether you have to kind of keep doing the same thing to realize, this is a bad idea, like I need to change now, like all of it's okay.
Yeah. And because sometimes it takes us a while to figure things out.
Even with me recently, like I have started my mare under saddle and was just having some issues with saddle fit and things like that. And I got someone out and she fitted the saddle and I was like, still just doesn't feel right. Like it just doesn't look right. And I feel like this particular fitter she recommended a saddle to me. I got it. And then she just did what she could to kind of make it fit as well as it could. Right. And I was like, I kept having this resistance to riding her with the saddle because I knew even though she's green, and I've ridden her bareback in the bareback pad with this particular saddle, she just didn't feel as 100%. And it also felt weird riding her as well. And my intuition's getting like louder and louder on this journey too. And then what I find that I do is sometimes I'll get in this avoidance pattern of being like, I just won't ride, or I'll do other things. And then it was funny, and this often happens to me. A client recently, she was like, having some, like her horse was not 100% happy, and she put the saddle on and she went to do the girth up, and then he was not happy and she took a step back and she's looked at all the ulcer things and she was like, interesting. This like my saddle doesn't fit anymore. And her saddle was fitted exactly the same way as my mare's saddle and the same issues. And then I was like, okay, this is my sign to like sell this saddle, get another saddle fitter and change the damn saddle. But this has taken me like months to kind of like actually follow through on. So I like to kind of humanize these experiences because sometimes we can get in our own head, even if you have all the knowledge and you can look at it and be like, that doesn't look right. Like sometimes these things take time to soak in.
Yeah, and for us to just figure it out. I mean, we don't always experience the world in the same way. And even when we are intuitive, then we need to kind of track, okay, what does this mean? And what does that change look like? And what wait for that information to drop. Like sometimes with intuition, oftentimes with intuition, it doesn't come like a bolt to the head. It comes like subtle little moments like that where you see something else and you're like, right, like, okay, course correct. Like it's
and you look back and you're like, the signs were there all this time, and you're like, okay, well, maybe one day I'll be able to listen to the first sign and that'll be it. But
you and me both. It's been like forever and like 20 years, and I'm still like
A lot of people think that like when you're tapped in, you're just like ding, like on the path, and it's just like we're human.
We're all human. I know the other day, Raven almost never spooks at stuff. Diva and her are very different that way. And Diva is much more like, say, a tractor would like roll into the field. Diva would be like 50 to 100 feet away going, and then Raven would have her head inside the bucket. What is in here? So that's kind of like the difference between them. Yeah. And so the other day, the neighbor built this greenhouse, and Raven was having all the trouble like coming out of her field, which of course the entrance is like right across from the new greenhouse, like 10, 15 feet away. And I was like, what is happening? I thought she was being like naughty and like, why aren't you listening to me? And like, you know, I kind of put all this stuff, you know, out there. And then I just went and stood in front of this greenhouse and realized, oh yeah, like it's made of that kind of corrugated plastic. And it looks like glowy, iridescent almost.
Yeah.
And I think her eyes, because she likes to touch things to kind of figure them out, and because she couldn't reach it, she couldn't make sense of this weird, like probably coloration and texture. And so it was like making her nervous. Right. And I hadn't been used to that. I'm used to her just being like whatever about everything. And so it hadn't even like factored in for me that this could be a thing. So I think sometimes it's about taking the pause and just having a look around, like, okay, you know, my horse is acting differently. Is there something that's changed or shifted in the environment? And not only greenhouses or things like that, but is there a new horse at the barn? Is there a new person at the barn? Is there a new worker? Has the weather shifted? All of these things we may not even be paying attention to, but you better believe your horses are noticing them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And especially if you've already established like, oh yeah, I think I know my horse pretty well. Or if they've like in the past, like you said, she's always happy to touch things. So the time where she doesn't want to touch things, it's like, interesting. Or like if your horse is always happy offering a particular behavior and then one day they don't, it's like, they haven't forgotten. No. There's something wrong or there's something off, like worth exploring.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Speaking of which, I noticed Diva on her right lead today. I need to do some body work on her tomorrow. Because I was like, oh, she just doesn't want to pick up her trot as easily on this right lead. That's interesting. And those are feedback pieces rather than thinking of it like she's being bad or this is behavioral or she's just being lazy or whatever. Hey, no, like let's chunk it back. Is there something going on in her body? Are her feet sore? Is there something that's changed in her environment that might be creating more tension or soreness? I like the idea. I think it's so critical to give our horses the benefit of the doubt.
And I think ourselves as well, like, because I know a lot of people in that instance will start to blame themselves. What did I miss? I should have picked this up earlier. Like, oh my goodness, like, was it this thing that I did? Did I push them too hard the other day? And it's like, if we can do our best, and sometimes it's not always easy to approach things with a lens of curiosity and be like, okay, this is a moment in today. What are the variables that change today and what can I shift potentially to support my horse and myself? And if it's like, let's just say it's something that's not as like need to get the vet out kind of thing, just give yourself like, see how they are tomorrow. It could just be a day. Totally. You know, and same with you. Like if you have an off day, it's not like, oh my goodness, my life's over. It's like, just see how you feel when you wake up tomorrow. Eat, drink some water,
have a bath,
sleep well.
No, absolutely. Take some magnesium. Everybody take some magnesium. I ran out of magnesium last week and it was like an absolute, it was like, oh, I really need that supplement apparently. Yeah. So everybody out there, magnesium, it's important.
That's a second sign I've heard that, like, cause I was, I'm in this mastermind group at the moment to get support for me. And I was saying about how like being on back-to-back Zoom calls sometimes, like afterwards I just end up in this like doom scroll. And one of the women was saying like how it's because of all the EMFs, like, and you kind of get like locked into it. And she was like, go on grounds, like bare feet on the grass, or like if you can't do that or it's too cold, like have a bath with Epsom salts or magnesium salts, and or like a foot bath. And I still haven't bought the stuff yet. So thank you.
Go to it.
I will do it.
Always have magnesium in the house. Absolutely. Especially for those of us that it's like, if we're working a little, like we're all energetic beings. It's super grounding. Like those salts sort of just bring us back down to earth. And we all get kind of inundated. And then, with the magnesium for me, like muscle spasms, it's a big one, and just soreness and tension. So if any of you out there get like just general muscle tension and achiness, that I take like magnesium biglycinate, and I really love it. And also excellent bowel movements, everyone.
Oh, there you go.
Super important. So just, to break that seal.
Fiber and magnesium.
Absolutely. Yeah, if possible, you should all be going once a day. Very, very helpful for detoxing and other things. I've never talked about that on here, but it is very critical.
But I think that's another one of those things that it's really important.
It's really important. And it's like, so like, but I mean, I've had clients, like osteo clients, that have reached out literally and said, oh my God, I just had the best poop of my life. I've had several say that. And I'm like, this is fabulous. Like, what an excellent testimonial, right?
Yeah. This woman that I follow, and she has what's like, with her clients, she uses what's called the BEAM protocol. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but essentially she healed her, or went into remission from really chronic Crohn's by incorporating soluble fiber into her diet through beans, and obviously keeping her diet super clean and all of that. And she works with a lot of people that have really bad acne or really bad periods or all sorts of different problems, and use this. And she'll often post about like pooping and bowel movements, and how important it is, because when you're having the bowel movements, it's your bile is binding with all of the shit in your system that needs to be excreted into shit. It can leave your body. Otherwise it's just circulating in your body and can't go anywhere. And it's really interesting with those sorts of things. I reckon there's so many people, this is probably where TikTok and Reels, like when people do post about more of the, we shouldn't talk about these topics, like people are fascinated because everybody does it.
Like we all do it. Hopefully, I would hope that we all are having bowel movements. But it's really funny how we don't speak about this. A healthy colon for riders is super important. And the colon actually runs, so we start in like the small intestine, and then we come over to the right hip, and the colon like tracks up inside the ileum up to the diaphragm. It literally like hangs off the diaphragm, and then comes across in the transverse colon, again hangs off the diaphragm on the other side, and then tracks down over the left hip, like over the ileum, and then into the rectum. But what we have to realize is, like, when we don't have a healthy colon, like it's not moving well, and one of the symptoms of that is often constipation, but also bloating and gas and all these things, which is so common, like so common. When the colon is not moving well, it can actually bind the hip. So like it will actually adhese to, because of inflammation in the gut, it will adhese fascially to the inside of the ileum on both sides or one side. So what I often find is that, a big part of pelvic movement or lack thereof is actually like digestively related, because the colon is stuck onto the inside of the ileum and not allowing movement. As well, the sigmoids on the left comes across where the sacrum, like the top part of the sacrum, the hemibase of the left sacrum. And so we can actually get a change in that side of the sacrum if the colon's not moving well, if there's an issue in the sigmoid. So I actually recommend to a lot of my clients like abdominal massage, moving over to the left ilium, up, across under the diaphragm, and then down the other side. And there's lots of videos and stuff online about that. But just really prioritizing our digestive health, because at the end of the day, that biome, that gut biome is critical. Like just with our horses, I mean, horses, there's an epidemic with horses of digestive issues. I mean, gosh, like I was talking to someone yesterday and I was like, oh, this horse has fecal water. And she's like, who doesn't have fecal water? It's like this. It's like, oh, that's kind of true.
Like, it's like that should not, like,
that should not be happening. But it does. Like so many horses that I go out and see, it's like, you know, massage therapists, beware, there is poop all over their butts or their legs. You know, it's very, very common. Ulcers, super, super common.
So common.
We hear it all the time, you know, colics, like all this stuff, even if they're minor. You know, so this sense of prioritizing gut health, and Raven's taught me so much about this with horses, because she does require consistent support with her gut health, building her microbiome. She'll actually ask for different probiotics at different times to support various strains of probiotic in her system, to support the growth of healthy bacteria in her gut, right? And I find that so interesting. Like I love checking in with her. Okay, what one do we need now? Like, what are you requiring? Do I buy this one again, or do we switch up and try something that's like a little bit of a different plethora of bacteria or different nutrients that are like gut healing, or, you know, what's the strategy?
How do you tune in to like ask her that? Do you like literally have them muscle testing? Muscle
testing. Yeah. So I'll just muscle test. Right now she's on visceral from Mad Barn, which isn't in your, it's not in Australia, but here in Canada, it's one of kind of our bigger supplement companies. That's her favorite. But also there's a company called Adored Beast that do an equine specific strains of healthy bacteria. It's really, really interesting. And then for our own gut health, okay, what are we doing to support our own gut health? What are we giving to ourselves food-wise, supplementally, but also in terms of like with our horses, one of the biggest things, movement. How much are we moving? Like, and it's great with horse people because most of the time, especially if we have our horses at home, we're moving a ton because we're like mucking and feeding, and it's great, right? And but yeah, like really, really prioritizing that. And for our horses, this is why I love paddock paradises and stuff like that.
And it's interesting. It's just like back to the name of your podcast, like the whole horse podcast. It's like looking at every single piece as like a puzzle to this big equation, because they all go together. And then it's just also from the rider or the horse owner's point of view, reflecting on that. And we're all not perfect by any means, but it's like if you're focusing on your horse's bowel movements and their nutrition, it's just like, okay, well, how's yours too? And I'm not perfect in this area. This is something I'm working on. But it's just illuminating, thinking like, oh shit, like this is really important for them. And often, like we spoke about in my podcast the other week, our horses will help them first, and then we realize, oh, that could be good for me too.
Exactly. Duh. Like maybe I should do that too. Yeah, for certain. I think this is truly an area when we think about the digestive system and like the learning that we're doing now, or the studies that are coming out about the enteric nervous system in the gut, and like the way that is so interconnected with our autonomic nervous system, our ability to regulate, our ability to deal with stress. Like it's all connected, right? And I think in some ways, like Raven has had this arthritis from a very early age, and I think a large part is, you know, involved with gut health. You know, she wasn't able to absorb the nutrients properly that she was getting. You know, like all these things kind of didn't happen for her, right? And but that's something that you can support now. So like you may be looking at arthritis and going, I've got to treat it specifically at the leg, in the foot, wherever it is. But think more globally. Look at it more from a sense of whole horse. How is their gut health? Like, how are they absorbing? How are they moving? what is their health? Like, how's their coat? How's like, what's happening globally in this horse that could give me a sense of like how to support them in a different way. And I love that, like, when we can see it, it's like, then we start to see like a full health picture, which is really cool.
Totally. And it's really cool. Like, as you were saying all these things, I'm like, how incredible are our bodies, like just functioning on what we give them that isn't great. But then it's like, imagine how good you're going to feel and our horse is going to feel when you do support yourself and you support them in a more optimal way, or just improve what you are doing. Like, it's only going to make things better. And yeah, you can see like there's so many visual and external markers of like something's working or something's not working. Like we could all look at our own bodies and be like, oh, I'm really dehydrated. Like my pee's really yellow, or not having the bowel movements, or maybe I'm really bloated, or maybe I feel really stiff and achy. And it's like, okay, well, these are all physical manifestations of something else. And same with our horses. Like like you're saying, how do they look? How are they moving? Yeah, there's a lot of information. Well, I guess the essence of this podcast is really like pay attention to the small signs and like work on those things. Or it could be big, but like break it down.
Break it down. Because, we can get so overwhelmed. It's like, no, like, let's just be curious. Like, I think that's why I love working like with muscle testing and that sort of thing. Is I'm like, oh, like if you feel like a little bit of a kitchen witch, right? Like, oh, just like tweak this a little bit. And you know what? We're so lucky at this time because if you're feeling overwhelmed, there's so many great resources to work with. Like if you're living in Canada, you can go see a naturopath to support you with your gut health and your microbiome. And like, we've had some excellent nutritionists, and I'm sure that that's happening more and more there. Like, this is becoming more of a thing. Thank goodness that we can have a team around and support around. Right. So yeah, I think that that's so cool. So yeah, good convo.
Yeah. Went in all sorts of directions once again. Love it.
You never ever know when you listen in. Hey, yeah, thanks for sticking with us, everyone, through training to bowel movements.
Yeah, did you think your 100th podcast episode would be talking about?
Well, we got to go all the places into the shadowlands.
We have to. Yeah, exactly. How are you feeling about like, reflecting on your 100 podcast episodes and all of that? Like, are there any like takeaways you want to share about like from your journey podcasting or anything like that? I'm just turning it back on you.
Oh yeah, you totally are. Putting me on the spot. Yeah, I just think it's this beautiful ripple effect. I really appreciated the community that I've experienced through this work, and seeing kind of the magic of what happens when you start to have a conversation and you just see where it goes, right? So
super cool. And I think it's also a great invitation for people, even if you don't have a podcast, like reach out to people that you want to have a conversation with. Like if you have something that you want to share and like discuss with them, like sure, a lot of people would be really open to having a conversation with you. Like we're all craving connection.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think we get shy, but honestly, like, it's that place of just we don't know until we try. So I think
and what's the worst that could happen? They don't respond or they say no, and you're in the same place that you're in right now.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. Good one. Well, thank you for being here for my 100th episode.
Thank you. I feel very grateful and loved where this conversation went in all the directions. And yeah, I'm excited to I feel like we're going to have lots more conversations. I don't know.
I have that sense as well, and I'm excited about that. So upward and onward, and thanks everybody for tuning in. And I hope you continue to tune in from 100 and beyond.
Yes, amazing. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Have a great day. Bye for now. Hi everyone. You may have heard that I, along with Elise Miki, am hosting Lockie Phillips in Langley, BC on May 13th and 14th, 2023. And we have one space that's opened up for a full participant. And I thought I would drop that in here just to see if there's anyone out there listening that has been yearning and craving for a whole horse experience. This 2 days together will essentially unpack everything about what's going on for you and your horse, including a full treatment with Elise, plus all of her amazing assessment, osteo assessment, as well as a full assessment and treatment with myself, and a hoof assessment with Lockie, and a full day of horsemanship. So it's going to be pretty amazing. It's happening in Langley, BC, and if you're interested, you can reach out to me at alexa@alexalinton.com, or head to Lockie's website at emotionalhorsemanship.com and look for his Langley Whole Horse Clinic. I hope to see you there. There's also auditor spots available if you're interested. Okay, bye for now.